Bo Diddley engineered the rhythmic pulse that built rock and roll. Yet, the executives at Chess Records deliberately erased him from the financial empire he created. They systematically stole his publishing rights, transferring his generational wealth straight into their own pockets. He was the true architect of a global revolution who was left holding the knob while others ran through the door. The boy's biological father, Eugene Bates, was a phantom. He vanished into the ether of history, leaving a teenage mother to face the crushing reality of the Mississippi Delta alone. This was Ellis's first and most defining trauma, the trauma of being an impossible burden. He was not born into a family unit. He was born into a survival crisis. Ethel Wilson, starved of resources and trapped in a society that offered her zero protection or opportunity, was forced to make a harrowing choice. She could watch her son starve, or she could give him away. She chose the latter, handing the infant over to her older cousin, Gussie McDaniel. It was an act of profound, desperate love disguised as abandonment. Yet for the child, the psychological wound was permanently etched. From his earliest days of consciousness, Ellis understood that security was an illusion and that survival required constant adaptation. The illusion of stability in the McDaniel household shattered in 1934 when Gussie's husband, Robert, died. Ellis was just 5 years old. The Great Depression was ravaging the nation, but in the segregated South, the economic collapse was a death sentence. Facing the prospect of raising 4 children, her own 3 and Ellis, in a landscape dominated by lynchings and economic terror, Gussie made the only logical decision available to her. She packed whatever meager belongings they had and joined the Great Migration. They boarded a northbound train, tracing the steel veins of the Illinois Central Railroad away from the agrarian nightmare of Mississippi toward the industrial grind of Chicago, arriving on Chicago's South Side. The family entered a radically different world. The South Side was a segregated enclave, overcrowded and harsh, but it pulsed with a frantic, desperate energy. It was a place where rural Southern traditions collided violently with Northern urban industrialism. It was here that the boy shed his past. He dropped the middle name Otha and legally took his adoptive mother's surname. Ellis Otha Bates died on the train ride up. Ellis McDaniel stepped onto the Chicago pavement. Gussie McDaniel was a fiercely devout woman, and her survival strategy in the chaotic urban landscape of Chicago was rooted in strict religious discipline. She anchored her family in the Ebenezer Missionary Baptist Church. This was not a humble, quiet country parish. Ebenezer was a powerhouse of Black cultural expression, widely recognized as the birthplace of professional gospel choirs in Chicago. For Gussie, the church was a fortress against the vice and poverty of the streets. She was determined to mold Ellis into a respectable, educated young man. Upward mobility, she believed, required assimilation into the finer, more refined aspects of culture. She did not want him playing the gritty, unpolished music of the Southern dirt they had just escaped. She wanted him to play classical music. For 12 agonizingly disciplined years, Ellis was placed under the strict tutelage of Professor O.W. Frederick. He was handed a violin, the ultimate symbol of European classical refinement, and told to practice. He also learned the trombone. Day after day, year after year, he drilled classical scales, perfected his bowing technique, and learned the rigid architecture of Western musical theory. This forced classical education was a psychological battleground. The violin represented Gussie's desperate plea for middle-class respectability. It was an attempt to civilize the Mississippi out of him. But as Ellis grew from a boy into a teenager, his own body began to betray his classical training. He was growing into a large, powerfully built young man. Most notably, his hands were becoming massive. He would later affectionately refer to them as meat hooks. These were not the delicate, nimble fingers required to navigate the tightly packed strings of a small, fragile violin. His physical reality was violently clashing with the delicate instrument he was forced to play. The violin was becoming a physical and psychological prison. His massive hands cramped, his aggressive, Natural energy felt suffocated by the rigid constraints of classical sheet music. He was a teenager boiling with the frustration of the urban black experience, and the polite tones of a classical violin were entirely inadequate to express the rage and rhythm building inside his chest. The true awakening occurred outside the walls of the Baptist church. Walking the streets of the South Side, Ellis was captivated by the sounds erupting from the local Pentecostal, or sanctified, storefront churches. Unlike the structured choral anthems of his own church, the Pentecostal services were chaotic, raw, and driven by an overwhelming, syncopated rhythm. Congregants stamped their feet, clapped their hands, and used their bodies as percussive instruments. It was a direct, unfiltered continuation of the African polyrhythms that had survived the Middle Passage and the slave plantations. At the exact same time, the airwaves of Chicago were being hijacked by the electric blues. Listening to the radio, Ellis heard the hypnotic, droning boogie of John Lee Hooker and the aggressive slide guitar of Muddy Waters. It was a sonic revelation. This music was not polite. It did not ask for acceptance from white, middle-class society. It was dangerous, electrical, and dripping with the mud of the Delta. Recognizing her brother's growing obsession, his older sister Lucille scraped together enough money to buy him a battered acoustic guitar for Christmas. It was an act of quiet rebellion against Gussie's strict household rules. When Gussie saw the instrument, she was horrified. To a devout Baptist woman of her generation, the blues was not just a genre of music. It was the devil's music. It was the soundtrack to the juke joints, the liquor houses, and the moral ruin that she had dragged her family to Chicago to escape. She strictly forbade him from playing it in the house, but the prohibition only fueled his obsession. Ellis began a double life. By day, he was the dutiful son and the obedient classical student. By night, in secret corners and quiet alleys, he was teaching himself to play the devil's music, trying to violently force his oversized fingers to replicate the sounds of John Lee Hooker on a cheap acoustic neck. He quickly realized that if he was going to survive in this world, he needed a trade. The streets of Chicago did not reward dreamers. They rewarded those who could work with their hands. He enrolled in the Foster Vocational High School, a decision that would inadvertently change the course of musical history. At Foster, he did not study art or music. He studied carpentry and mechanics. He learned how to cut wood, how to wire circuits, and how things were built from the ground up. This pragmatic, working-class education armed him with a distinct advantage over every other musician on the South Side. Ellis McDaniel was not just a player. He was becoming an engineer. When he realized that his acoustic guitar was too quiet to be heard over the roar of the Chicago streets, he didn't have the money to buy a manufactured electric amplifier. So, he built one. Applying his vocational training, he dismantled an abandoned Victrola record player, extracted the magnetic pickup needle, and clamped it to the metal tailpiece of his acoustic guitar to capture the vibrations of the strings. He wired this crude, homemade pickup into a makeshift speaker. It was a monstrous, beautiful invention born of absolute poverty. The sound it produced was distorted, jagged, and uniquely his own. Armed with his homemade electric weapon, a young, teenage Ellis hit the pavement of the legendary Maxwell Street Market. Maxwell Street was the ultimate proving ground. It was a sprawling, chaotic open-air bazaar where vendors screamed over one another. Hustlers worked the crowds, and bluesmen played for whatever loose change was thrown into their hats. It was a merciless environment. If you couldn't hold the crowd's attention, you starved. Here, a 13-year-old Ellis stood shoulder to shoulder with older, hardened blues veterans, including the slide guitar prodigy Earl Hooker. The street demanded volume, it demanded rhythm, and it demanded an absolute, unshakable confidence. Ellis had to project his voice and his heavily distorted guitar over the roar of the Chicago transit system and the haggling masses. To command more attention, he formed a street corner band. They initially called themselves the Hipsters, later changing their name to the Langley Avenue Jive Cats. The lineup was a testament to urban resourcefulness. A local kid named Roosevelt Jackson played a bass made from a galvanized washtub and a broom handle. But the most vital addition was a young man named Jerome Green. Green did not play a melodic instrument. He held a pair of maracas. Ellis and Jerome developed a fierce, rapid-fire stage dynamic. Instead of singing traditional melodies, they shouted at each other over the relentless shaking of the maracas and the thumping of the washtub bass. They were trading insults, telling jokes, and riding a continuous, aggressive groove. There were no complex chord changes. There was only the beat. The psychological transformation was complete. The unwanted infant from Mississippi, who had been molded into a classical violinist by a desperate mother seeking respectability, had weaponized his trauma. He had taken the rejection of his birth, the strict discipline of the church, the mechanical knowledge of the vocational school, and the ruthless survival instincts of Maxwell Street, and forged them into an entirely new persona. He was a carpenter who built his own sound, a giant with meat hooks who treated the guitar like a tuned drum. As the 1940s bled into the 1950s, Ellis McDaniel had conquered the street corners. He was playing with a feral, hypnotic intensity that no one in Chicago had ever heard before. He had the rhythm, he had the band, and he had the unyielding arrogance of a man who had pulled himself out of the gutter. He was standing on the precipice of a cultural revolution, waiting for a stage big enough to hold his anger, but he needed a name that matched the immense, primal weight of his sound. The transformation from Ellis McDaniel, the resourceful street busker, into the cultural monolith known as Bo Diddley required more than just a homemade guitar and a pair of maracas. It required an identity that could function as both a weapon and a shield. In the early 1950s, a black man in America stepping onto a stage needed an armor to survive the predatory gaze of the entertainment industry. The name Bo Diddley provided exactly that. Its origins are a complex web of street survival, ancestral memory, and racial reclamation. In the boxing rings of the South Side, where young Ellis sparred as a member of the little neighborhood Golden Gloves bunch, he was known to throw heavy, unpredictable punches. His peers began calling him Bo Diddley. In the harsh slang of the era, diddly squat meant absolutely nothing. To be told you had diddly squat was to be reminded of your poverty, your lack of status, and your insignificance in a white-dominated society. By adopting the name, Ellis took the very insult used to diminish him and wore it as a crown. He weaponized his own marginalization, but the name carried a much deeper, almost subconscious historical weight. In the rural Mississippi Delta that Ellis had fled, the poorest black children learned to play music on a diddly bow. It was the most primitive instrument imaginable, a single strand of broom wire nailed to the side of a wooden shack, plucked with a glass bottle. The diddly bow was a direct descendant of the single-stringed monochords of Central Africa. Furthermore, the name echoed Bo Diddley, a swaggering, unapologetic character in a 1921 short story by the brilliant Harlem Renaissance author Zora Neale Hurston. Whether Ellis consciously assembled these cultural fragments, or whether the name simply found him on the streets of Chicago, it perfectly encapsulated his mission. He was the embodiment of the African ancestral memory crashing into the industrial noise of the northern ghetto. By 1951, this relentless sound had outgrown the open-air chaos of Maxwell Street. Ellis, Jerome Green, and Roosevelt Jackson fought their way indoors, securing a regular residency at the 708 Club, a notorious and vital hub for Chicago blues. It was within the sweaty, packed confines of the 708 Club that the most important rhythmic innovation of the 20th century was forged. To the uneducated ear, the Bo Diddley beat sounded like a catchy, primitive thump. In reality, it was a profound act of historical defiance. The pattern bump, 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 bump is known to musicologists as the sun clave. It is the foundational rhythmic structure of sub-Saharan Africa, a pattern that survived the horrors of the Middle Passage and embedded itself in Afro-Cuban rumba and Caribbean folk music. However, its presence in North American music carries a distinctly brutal history. During the era of chattel slavery in the American South, plantation owners quickly realized that enslaved Africans used drums not merely for music, but as a sophisticated language to communicate across vast distances and orchestrate rebellions. Terrified by this covert communication network, white slaveholders legally banned the drum. Stripped of their instruments, enslaved people refused to be silenced. They turned their own bodies into drums. They developed the hambone or the juba dance, a complex system of slapping the chest, thighs, and cheeks to create syncopated polyrhythms. The hambone was a rhythm of survival, a way to keep the culture breathing when the tools of expression had been violently confiscated. Bo Diddley, a man who had rejected the European structure of the classical violin, instinctively reached back into this ancestral trauma. He famously claimed that he stumbled upon his signature beat while trying to play the country and western song, "I've Got Spurs That," Jingle, Jangle, Jingle by Gene Autry. His hands, searching for a Western melody, naturally defaulted to the African clave. What Bo Diddley did next changed the world. He took the acoustic, body-slapping hambone of the enslaved and plugged it into a high-voltage electrical amplifier. He electrified the trauma. He weaponized the rhythm. This is why the architecture of Bo Diddley's music was so threatening to the musical establishment. He completely discarded the rules of Western harmonic progression. He did not care about delicate chord changes, bridges, or melodic resolutions. In his hands, the electric guitar ceased to be a melodic instrument and became a tuned drum. Many of his compositions were anchored on one single, aggressive, unyielding chord that hammered away for 3 straight minutes. He forced the listener to abandon melody and submit entirely to the rhythm. It was a radical, subconscious rejection of European musical assimilation. This unrelenting force inevitably attracted the attention of the men who controlled the business of rhythm in Chicago, the Chess brothers. Leonard and Phil Chess were Polish-Jewish immigrants who had built an empire by recording the rawest, most visceral black musicians on the South Side and selling their records to a rapidly expanding market of white teenagers. The Chess brothers were brilliant businessmen, but their operation was built on a deeply exploitative economic model. They understood that the trauma and passion of the black experience could be commodified. In late 1954, Bo Diddley brought his band into the studio to audition. They recorded a 2-song demo that crackled with an unprecedented menacing energy. The first track was "I'm a Man." In the context of 1950s Jim Crow America, where black men were routinely infantilized, humiliated, and referred to as boy by the white establishment, a black artist standing in front of a microphone and declaring "I'm a man" over a grinding, aggressive blues riff was not just a song. It was a political statement. It was a declaration of supreme, unshakable dignity. It was dangerous. The second track was a syncopated, churning groove, originally titled Uncle John. Leonard Chess heard the commercial potential immediately, but he also understood the racial boundaries of mainstream radio. He deemed the original lyrics to Uncle John too provocative, too culturally specific, and too dirty for white consumption. He demanded that the lyrics be sanitized and forced Ellis to rename the song after his own stage moniker. The track became Bo Diddley. Chess signed him to an exclusive contract under their subsidiary label, Checker Records. When the 2-sided single was released in March 1955, it hit the American public like a shockwave. The record bypassed the traditional blues audience and infected the mainstream, rocketing to the #1 spot on the Billboard R&B charts. Bo Diddley had arrived, but his arrival immediately put him on a collision course with the ultimate gatekeeper of American respectability. In the 1950s, television was a monolithic cultural force, and the Sunday night Ed Sullivan Show was its undisputed center. Ed Sullivan was the arbiter of what was acceptable in American living rooms. He curated a careful, sanitized vision of entertainment designed not to offend the conservative post-war middle class. An invitation to perform on The Sullivan Show was the holy grail of show business. It guaranteed national superstardom. but it also required total obedience to the host's strict, uncompromising rules. In November 1955, capitalizing on the massive success of his debut record, Bo Diddley was booked to appear on the program. However, the producers of the show and Sullivan himself had no intention of letting Bo play his own aggressive, culturally defiant hit. They demanded that he perform 16 Tons, a song popularized by Tennessee Ernie Ford. The irony was suffocating. 16 Tons was a song about the crushing debt of coal miners trapped in the company store system, a theme of economic exploitation that perfectly mirrored Bo Diddley's own life. But the Tennessee Ernie Ford version was a polished, sterile, acceptable interpretation of working-class struggle. Sullivan wanted Bo Diddley to be a subservient entertainer, a compliant black man singing a safe, popular song to appease a white audience. Bo Diddley had not survived the poverty of Mississippi, the discipline of the Baptist Church, and the brutal hustle of Maxwell Street just to be told what to play by a television host in New York. On the night of November 20, 1955, as he stood backstage holding his guitar, the tension was palpable. As he prepared to walk out under the glaring studio lights, he glanced at the cue card held by a stagehand. In massive bold letters, it read Bo Diddley. The producers had written his name on the card to introduce him, but Bo, relying on his street instincts and possessing a massive streak of defiance, later claimed he thought the cue card was an instruction of what to play. The cameras went live. Millions of Americans tuned in. Ed Sullivan stood to the side, expecting the gentle baritone opening of 16 Tons. Instead, Bo Diddley struck his guitar, launching into the frantic, tribal, unapologetic ham-bone rhythm of his self-titled hit. Jerome Green shook the maracas violently. The beat pounded through the television sets of America, completely shattering the polite, orchestrated atmosphere of the CBS studio. Bo was not standing still behind a microphone. He was moving, shaking, delivering a sound that was fundamentally alien to the conservative viewers of the 1950s. It was a moment of absolute cultural rupture. Rock and roll, in its purest, most African-rooted form, was being broadcast directly into the nervous system of the American middle class. When the performance ended and the cameras cut away, the backstage area descended into chaos. Ed Sullivan was apoplectic. To defy him on live television was an act of professional suicide. Sullivan confronted Bo Diddley in the dressing room, his face flushed with rage. The host screamed at the young musician, berating him for his disobedience. Sullivan, wielding his absolute power over the entertainment industry, looked at the 26-year-old guitarist and delivered what he believed was a death sentence. He told Bo that he was a nobody. He stated, with absolute, venomous certainty, that Bo Diddley would not last 6 months in this business. Sullivan then permanently banned him from the program. The psychological implication of this confrontation is profound. Bo Diddley was offered the keys to the kingdom, but only if he agreed to suppress his own identity and become a sanitized puppet for a white establishment. He chose to play his own name. He chose to play his own beat. The ban from The Ed Sullivan Show cost him dearly in terms of mainstream crossover promotion, but it cemented his soul. He walked out of that CBS studio not as a compliant entertainer, but as the originator. He had drawn a line in the sand. He would not be managed, he would not be civilized, and he would not apologize for the sound of his own survival. But as he was about to learn, defying a television host was easy compared to fighting the structural, economic machinery of the record industry that was already tightening its grip around his throat. The aftermath of the Ed Sullivan Show ban did not destroy Bo Diddley, but it fundamentally altered the trajectory of his career. The American television establishment had forcefully shut its most lucrative door in his face, sending a clear message. If you do not conform to our sterilized vision of entertainment, you will be starved of the spotlight. For a man who had already survived the crushing poverty of the Mississippi Delta and the brutal hustle of the Chicago streets, this rejection was not a deterrent. It was a catalyst. If the gatekeepers of white, middle-class culture would not accommodate his rhythm, He would simply build an empire entirely on his own terms. This relentless drive for self-determination manifested not just in his music, but in the very physical tools he used to create it. In the mid-1950s, the standard electric guitar, such as the Gibson L5 he had been playing, was a heavy, hollow-bodied instrument designed for jazz musicians who sat on stools or stood relatively still. But Bo Diddley did not stand still. His live performances were athletic, frenetic, and deeply physical, echoing the ecstatic convulsions of the sanctified churches of his youth. He leaped, he dropped to his knees, and he thrashed the instrument. During one particularly violent stage maneuver, the massive wooden body of his traditional guitar jammed hard into his groin. The physical agony of the injury forced a realization. The tools provided by the musical establishment were physically incompatible with the raw, bodily expression of his art. Drawing upon the mechanical and carpentry skills he had acquired at the Foster Vocational High School, he decided to redesign the instrument from the ground up. He did not care about the aesthetic traditions of European instrument making, which favored the curved, feminine shapes of violins and Spanish acoustic guitars. He wanted a weapon that was functional, lightweight, and entirely his own. He sat down and sketched a guitar with a perfectly rectangular body. It was an exercise in brutalist architecture applied to music. There were no curves, no elegant contours, just a solid block of electricity. He took his blueprints to the Gretsch Guitar Company, which agreed to custom build the design to his exact specifications. The result was the twang machine, an instrument so visually jarring that television host Dick Clark dismissively referred to it as a cigar box guitar. But it was far from a novelty item. The rectangular shape removed the bulky horns and bouts that impeded his movement, allowing his hands and legs complete freedom to violently attack the strings and the stage. More importantly, the custom shape allowed him to become a sonic mad scientist. Long before the invention of external effects pedals that would define rock music in the late 1960s and 1970s, Bo Diddley was hardwiring advanced electronics directly into the hollowed-out cavities of his rectangular guitars. He worked with visionary builders like Tom Holmes to construct models such as the Cadillac and the Turbo 5-Speed. Into these geometric slabs of wood, he integrated built-in tremolo, reverb, delay, flangers, and envelope filters. He was manipulating the physics of sound waves, creating heavy, distorted, echoing textures that sounded like a freight train crashing through a swamp. He was a decade ahead of Jimi Hendrix in his understanding of electrical distortion. By building his own guitars, he reclaimed his physical and sonic agency. The music industry could ban him from television, but they could not control the frequency of his noise. Yet, a sinister paradox was beginning to unfold within the American music industry. The corporate establishment that found Bo Diddley personally threatening realized that the rhythm he had engineered, the electrified African clave, the Bo Diddley beat, was highly contagious and immensely profitable. They could not control the originator, but they could absolutely commodify his invention by placing it in the hands of more palatable white artists. This systemic cultural appropriation is the dark underbelly of the early rock and roll narrative. The beat that was born from the body-slapping ham bone of enslaved people, a rhythm of survival and resistance, was seamlessly repackaged as the soundtrack for white teenage rebellion. Buddy Holly, a brilliant but undeniably safe and polite white artist from Texas, took the exact Bo Diddley rhythm and used it as the engine for his massive hit Not Fade Away. The Strangeloves used it for I Want Candy. Johnny Otis built Willie and the Hand Jive squarely on its foundation. Later, the beat would be utilized by The Who on Magic Bus, Bruce Springsteen on She's the One, and even George Michael on Faith. The systemic cruelty of this phenomenon was not that other musicians were inspired by him. It was the economic reality that accompanied it. The white artists who borrowed his rhythm were granted the television appearances, the massive promotional budgets, and the lucrative publishing contracts that were systematically denied to the black man who invented it. The industry eagerly stripped the African ancestral weight from the rhythm, polished it, and sold it back to a segregated America, generating untold millions in wealth that deliberately bypassed the architect. Bo Diddley was acutely aware of this dynamic. He recognized that the music industry was a predatory patriarchy, a boys' club driven by exploitation, ego, and the subjugation of marginalized voices. Perhaps because he understood what it meant to be marginalized and exploited, he made a radical, unprecedented decision regarding the structure of his own band. In the deeply sexist, hyper-masculine world of 1950s and 1960s rock and roll, women were almost exclusively relegated to the roles of screaming groupies, passive muses, or background vocalists. They were treated as decorative commodities by promoters and musicians alike. Bo Diddley shattered this patriarchal norm with absolute finality. He became the first major male rock artist in history to prominently feature female musicians not as eye candy or backup singers, but as central, driving instrumentalists who held the weight of the groove. In 1957, he hired a ferociously talented young guitarist named Peggy Jones. Known to the world as Lady Bo, Jones was a revelation. She did not strum quiet acoustic chords in the background. She plugged in, turned up the amplifier, and played aggressive, distorted lead guitar on massive, defining hits like Hey, Bo Diddley, and Roadrunner. Bo Diddley did not feel threatened by her talent. He relied on it. He recognized that she possessed a deep, intrinsic understanding of the clave rhythm. Lady Bo would later proudly and accurately state that she was not merely a sidekick. She was a co-architect who helped lay the bricks of the house of rock and roll. When Peggy Jones departed the band in 1962 to pursue her own solo projects, Bo Diddley did not revert to an all-male lineup. He hired another female powerhouse, Norma Jean Wofford, and dubbed her the Duchess. Wofford was a striking presence, taking the stage in skin-tight gold lame outfits, but her visual impact was secondary to her staggering musical ability. She played a custom, rectangular Gretsch guitar just like her boss, matching him riff for heavy riff in blistering live duels. However, Bo Diddley's inclusion of women required more than just hiring them. It required protecting them from the very industry he was fighting. He knew intimately the predatory nature of male promoters, managers, and fellow musicians on the grueling Chitlin circuit and national tours. To shield Norma Jean Wofford from the relentless, aggressive sexual advances of the men in the business, Bo Diddley constructed a protective lie. He introduced her everywhere, and to everyone, as his biological sister. It was a brilliant, necessary survival tactic. By claiming blood relation, he invoked a primal code of respect that even the most predatory men hesitated to cross. He created a psychological force field around her, ensuring that she could focus entirely on her art without being consumed by the toxic masculinity of the touring environment. This profound respect for female musicianship remained a constant for the rest of his life, culminating in the 1980s when he hired Debbie Hastings as his bassist, a woman who would eventually become his musical director and remain by his side for over 25 years. This egalitarian, forward-thinking approach to his band only heightened the sheer power of his live performances, making him an unstoppable force on stage. But the ultimate testament to his global impact and the ultimate juxtaposition of his reality occurred when he crossed the Atlantic. By the early 1960s, a generation of British youth, traumatized by the aftermath of World War II, the Blitz, and years of economic rationing, were desperately searching for a cultural release valve. They found their salvation in the imported, scratchy vinyl records of American bluesmen. To these British teenagers, Bo Diddley was not a marginalized commodity, he was a god. In 1963, he embarked on a legendary tour of the United Kingdom. The bill was a staggering assembly of rock royalty, featuring the Everly Brothers, Little Richard, and Bo Diddley. Also on the bill was a ragged, fiercely ambitious, and relatively unknown local opening act, the Rolling Stones. The dynamic between Bo Diddley and the young British musicians was an incredible study in reverence. In America, Bo was actively being squeezed, manipulated, and underpaid by Chess Records, constantly fighting to maintain his dignity. In England, he was greeted with absolute religious awe. The Rolling Stones had practically learned to play their instruments by studying his records. His beat was the foundation of their entire sound. When the Stones realized they would be sharing a stage with their idol, they made a profound decision. Up to that point, their live set list had relied heavily on Bo Diddley covers. In a supreme act of submission and respect, the British band completely scrubbed every single Bo Diddley song from their repertoire for the duration of the tour. They refused to play his own music in his presence, acknowledging that they could only mimic what he had bled to create. Ronnie Wood, who was in the audience during that era and would later join the Stones, cited simply watching Bo Diddley's hands move across the rectangular guitar as a foundational, life-altering moment. For a brief, glorious period on that 1963 UK tour, the originator was treated exactly as his title demanded. He was revered as the architect. He saw firsthand the massive global tsunami of culture that his two hands and a homemade pickup had unleashed. But the tragic irony of that British tour was inescapable. The young, white English boys who were staring at him in awe were about to spearhead the British invasion. They were about to take the exact rhythms, the distortion, and the swagger that Bo Diddley had invented, package it for a global white audience, and become billionaires. As the British invasion conquered America, generating unfathomable wealth and changing the economic landscape of the entertainment industry forever, the man who had provided their blueprint was boarding a plane back to Chicago. He was returning to a country where he was still treated as a second-class citizen and returning to a record label that was already setting the stage for one of the most egregious, systematic financial robberies in the history of modern music. The beat had conquered the world, but the man who made it was about to be stripped bare. The triumphant return from the 1963 United Kingdom tour should have been the moment Ellis McDaniel ascended to the throne of American wealth. He had just witnessed the absolute cultural domination of his own invention. He had seen thousands of British teenagers and the very bands that would soon conquer the global charts bow down to his rhythm. But crossing the Atlantic back to the United States was a descent from the mountaintop back into a rigged, merciless economic machine. To understand the tragedy of Bo Diddley's middle years is to understand the vampiric architecture of the mid-20th century music business. It was an industry designed from the ground up to systematically transfer wealth from black creators to white executives, legally, quietly, and with devastating efficiency. The architects of this specific financial subjugation were the men who had given him his start, Leonard and Phil Chess. The Chess brothers operated their Chicago label under a carefully cultivated illusion of paternalistic benevolence. To the outside world, and often to the artists themselves, Chess Records presented itself as a family. Leonard Chess would hand out Cadillacs, advance cash for rent, and pay for medical bills out of his own pocket. But these cash handouts were not acts of generosity. They were instruments of control. They kept the artist dependent, functioning on an off-the-books ledger of constant, unpayable debt. The true financial slaughter occurred in the fine print of publishing rights. The Chess brothers, in partnership with a shrewd music publisher named Gene Goodman, established Arc Music. Arc Music was the publishing arm that absorbed the intellectual property of the artists on the Chess roster. In the music industry, wealth is not generated merely by performing a song once in a recording studio. Generational wealth is generated through publishing rights. The mechanical royalties paid every single time a song is pressed on a vinyl record, played on a jukebox, broadcast on the radio, or covered by another artist. Bo Diddley was completely excluded from this invisible river of money. When he went into the studio and recorded a masterpiece like Who Do You Love, the label treated him as a simple day laborer. They paid him a flat, upfront fee for his performance in the studio, essentially treating the recording session as hourly wage work. Meanwhile, the copyright, the ownership of the song's very existence, was swallowed by Ark Music. As the 1960s progressed, the systemic cruelty of this arrangement became suffocating. The British invasion was in full swing. Bands like the Rolling Stones, the Yardbirds, and the Animals were covering Bo Diddley's songs on albums that were selling millions of copies worldwide. The royalty checks generated by these global sales were astronomical. They flowed from Europe straight into the bank accounts of the executives in Chicago and New York. Bo Diddley, the man who wrote the songs and engineered the beat, saw absolutely nothing. The psychological violence of this economic starvation cannot be overstated. Ellis McDaniel was a proud man, a man who had fought his way out of the Mississippi dirt to build a dignified life for his family. He was a father who wanted to send his children to college and shield them from the poverty he had endured, but the system had placed him in a structural trap. By the late 1960s, as his own record sales inevitably slowed and the culture shifted towards psychedelic rock, he found himself facing a terrifying lack of liquidity to pay his bills, to keep his home, and to fund his children's education. He was forced into the most agonizing, humiliating corner an artist can face. He had to cannibalize his own legacy. Desperate for immediate cash, Bo Diddley was forced to sell the outright intellectual property rights of many of his greatest era-defining songs for a mere fraction of their actual value. He was forced to sell his soul to feed his blood. For decades, stretching all the way into the late 1980s, he did not receive a single penny in royalty payments for the cultural monuments he had built. He summarized this lifelong betrayal with a quote that stands as one of the most heartbreaking, surgically precise indictments of the American music industry ever spoken. "I opened the door for a lot of people to run through, and they just left me holding the knob. Yet, the true measure of a man's character is how he wields power when he finally obtains a fraction of it." The industry had taught Bo Diddley that the music business was a ruthless, zero-sum game of exploitation. He had every right to become a bitter, guarded miser. Instead, he did the exact opposite. He became a patron. He became the supportive infrastructure for the next generation that the Chess brothers had refused to be for him. Relocating to Washington, D.C., Bo utilized his lifelong skills as a carpenter and an engineer to build a fully functioning recording studio in the basement of his home. It became a sanctuary. Around this time, he met a young, fiercely talented, but completely unknown singer who was struggling to find a foothold in the brutal music scene. Recognizing the young man's potential, but knowing he needed a steady income to survive, Bo offered him a job. He hired the young singer to be his personal valet, his roadie, and his driver. But this was not an act of subjugation. It was a mentorship disguised as employment. While the young man carried amplifiers and drove the car, Bo gave him unrestricted access to the basement studio. He encouraged him to practice, to record his harmonies, and to develop his vocal arrangements on professional equipment that the young man could never have afforded on his own. That young valet was Marvin Gaye. Bo Diddley did not try to exploit Marvin Gaye's talent. He did not try to lock him into a predatory publishing contract. Instead, he actively used his own industry clout to push the young man forward. Bo personally introduced Marvin's vocal group, the Marquis, to executives at Columbia Records, helping them secure a recording contract. He literally opened the door, stood back, and let Marvin Gaye run through it toward his own legendary destiny. The juxtaposition is staggering. While the white executives in Chicago were actively starving the architect of rock and roll, the architect of rock and roll was in a basement in Washington, D.C., quietly feeding the future architect of soul. Bo Diddley's fight for economic justice was not a battle relegated to his youth. It was a relentless, exhausting war that stalked him into his twilight years. The mechanics of corporate exploitation simply evolved, trading the cigar smoke-filled offices of Chicago record labels for the sleek, glass-walled boardrooms of modern multinational corporations. By the late 1980s, Bo Diddley's cultural cachet had experienced a massive resurgence. The world recognized him as an elder statesman, an immortal icon whose very image represented the raw, authentic genesis of cool. In 1989, the athletic apparel giant Nike approached him to participate in a massive, multi-million-dollar advertising campaign built around the multisport phenom Bo Jackson. The campaign was titled Bo Knows. The commercial was a cultural phenomenon. It featured Bo Jackson attempting to play the guitar, failing miserably, and turning to Bo Diddley, who looked at him with absolute, undeniable authority and delivered the legendary punchline, "Bo, you don't know Diddley." The campaign was a colossal success, cementing Nike's dominance in the cultural zeitgeist and moving millions of dollars in merchandise. For a brief moment, it appeared that Bo Diddley was finally being compensated and respected by the corporate world at the level his legacy demanded. But the predatory nature of American business had not changed. It had only changed its branding. When the initial contract for the advertising campaign expired, Nike continued to manufacture, distribute, and profit from vintage-style apparel and T-shirts featuring Bo Diddley's likeness and his famous slogan. They did this without renewing his contract, without securing his ongoing permission, and, crucially, without paying him. They simply assumed that the aging bluesman would not have the stamina or the legal firepower to stop a global corporate monolith. They underestimated the street fighter from Maxwell Street. Bo Diddley had spent his entire life being robbed by men in suits, and he refused to let it happen again, even in his old age. He sent multiple cease-and-desist letters, which the corporation largely ignored. Finally, in 1999, at the age of 70, a time when most men are enjoying the quiet peace of retirement, Ellis McDaniel was forced to file a federal lawsuit against Nike in the Manhattan Federal Court. It was a profound, exhausting indignity. A 70-year-old pioneer, the man who had laid the rhythmic foundation for modern popular culture, had to drag his aging body into a federal courtroom to fight a multi-billion-dollar corporation just to maintain the legal ownership of his own face and his own name. He was fighting for the fundamental right that had been denied to him since the day he walked into Chess Records: the right to own himself. The lawsuit was eventually resolved, but the emotional and physical toll it took was a stark reminder of the lifelong burden he carried. He was never allowed to simply be an artist. He was forced to be a perpetual combatant, guarding the gates of his own legacy against a system that never stopped trying to pick his pockets. The systemic poverty of the Mississippi Delta, the stolen publishing rights at Chess Records, and the legal battles in corporate boardrooms were all connected by a single, unbreakable thread of economic violence. But Bo Diddley remained unbroken. As he entered his final decade, his body began to fail, but his spirit, anchored by the beat he had created, prepared for its final, most graceful act of defiance. The battlefield of the American music industry was not the only arena where Ellis McDaniel fought for a sense of stability and ownership. When a human being is stripped of their fundamental security at birth, handed away by a teenage mother desperate to survive the Mississippi Delta, the psychological reverberations echo through every intimate relationship they forge. Bo Diddley's private life was a turbulent, complex odyssey. It was the desperate, lifelong search of an abandoned child trying to construct the unbreakable family unit that the Jim Crow South had denied him. Yet, building a sanctuary while carrying the crushing weight of global fame and systemic financial exploitation is a nearly impossible architecture. His pursuit of love was marked by intense devotion, profound societal defiance, and inevitable heartbreak. He was married 4 times, each relationship a distinct chapter in his search for grounding. His first marriage to Louise Willingham occurred when he was just 18 years old, a young man still trying to carve his identity out of the Chicago streets. The union collapsed under the pressure of his nascent ambitions, lasting barely a year. In 1949, as his local reputation began to solidify, He married Ethel Mae Smith, a relationship that grounded him long enough to bring 2 children into the world. But it was his third marriage that would force him to confront the violent, deeply ingrained racial terrors of mid-century America. He married Kay Reynolds, and in doing so, he crossed the most dangerous, highly policed social boundary in the United States. She was white, and she was only 15 years old when they wed. To fully grasp the magnitude and the danger of this union, one must understand the absolute racial paranoia of the era. A prominent, powerful black man marrying a young white woman in the civil rights era United States was not merely a scandal, it was a physical risk. It was a time when the echoes of Emmett Till's murder still haunted the black consciousness, when the Ku Klux Klan operated with impunity, and when anti-miscegenation laws were still violently enforced in large swaths of the country. Bo Diddley did not care. His defiance was not limited to his music. He absorbed the societal backlash, the death threats, and the suffocating bigotry with the same broad-shouldered arrogance he brought to the stage. They had 2 daughters together, and their marriage was a profound, living testament to his refusal to let the white establishment dictate the parameters of his existence, whether in a recording studio or in his own bedroom. His final marriage, to Sylvia Pies in 1992, would ultimately end in divorce before his death, marking the end of a lifelong, restless pursuit of domestic peace. Finding no lasting sanctuary in the boardrooms of the music industry or the chaotic glare of the public eye, Bo Diddley sought refuge in an entirely different landscape. In the 1970s, the architect of rock and roll packed up his life and moved to the quiet, sprawling desert of Los Lunas, New Mexico. What he did next stands as one of the most fascinating, psychologically revealing contradictions of his entire life. The man who had revolutionized youth rebellion, the man who had famously defied Ed Sullivan on national television, put on a badge. From 1971 to 1978, Ellis McDaniel served as a deputy sheriff for the Valencia County Citizens Patrol. To the casual observer, a rock star becoming a law enforcement officer might seem like a bizarre publicity stunt, but looking through the lens of Bo Diddley's life, it makes perfect, heartbreaking sense. He had spent his entire adult life being victimized by men in suits who operated under the protection of the law. He had been robbed of millions of dollars by executives who weaponized contracts and copyright laws against him. The legal system of the United States had completely failed to protect his intellectual property or his financial security. By pinning a deputy sheriff's badge to his chest, Bo Diddley was reclaiming authority. He was taking literal ownership of the concept of justice. He wanted to be the man who protected the vulnerable, because no one had ever stepped in to protect him. His dedication to the badge was absolute and devoid of vanity. He spent 2.5 years actively riding patrol, responding to calls, and serving the citizens of Valencia County. When he realized that the local police department was severely underfunded and lacked the necessary equipment to effectively protect the community, he did not petition the government. He reached into his own pockets. Despite the fact that he had been systematically stripped of his royalties and was far from possessing the exorbitant wealth his legacy warranted, he personally purchased 3 high-speed highway patrol pursuit vehicles and donated them outright to the department. It is a staggering juxtaposition of character. The music industry, built on his back, bled him dry, yet, given the opportunity, he poured his own hard-earned road money into protecting a small desert community. He understood the value of a shield because he had spent his life absorbing the blows. But the badge could not protect him from the biological reality of his existence. The tragic consequence of being robbed of your publishing rights is that you are denied the luxury of retirement. While the white rock stars who had borrowed his beat were resting in gated estates, collecting massive residual checks while they slept, Bo Diddley had to keep moving. He was a working-class bluesman trapped in a perpetual cycle of physical labor. To pay for his home, to support his children, and to maintain his dignity, he had to haul his massive frame onto tour buses, navigate the grueling circuits of secondary venues, and play the guitar night after night, decade after decade. The road is a merciless environment. It demands a physical toll, paid in the currency of exhaustion, poor diet, and relentless stress. As he entered his late 70s, the architecture of his body began to buckle under the accumulated weight of this endless labor. He had a long documented history of diabetes and hypertension, the silent, systemic killers that disproportionately ravaged the black community, exacerbated by a lifetime of systemic stress and life on the road. Yet, he refused to stop. The stage was the only place where he maintained absolute, unquestionable control. On May 13, 2007, the physical bill finally came due. Bo Diddley had just finished delivering a blistering, high-energy performance to a packed crowd in Council Bluffs, Iowa. He had summoned the ancestral hambone, played the twang machine with his trademark ferocity, and given the audience exactly what they demanded. But shortly after walking off the stage, his body rebelled. He suffered a massive stroke. The neurological damage was devastating, and the cruelty of its specific manifestation was almost unbearable. The stroke severely affected his brain's language center, resulting in aphasia. The man who had built an empire on rapid-fire verbal sparring, who had matched Jerome Green insult for insult over shaking maracas, and who had confidently told a global corporation, "You don't know Diddley," was suddenly trapped in a body that could no longer form the words. The voice of the originator had been violently silenced by his own failing circuitry. He was rushed back to his home state of Florida to recover, but the structural integrity of the giant had been compromised. Just 3 months later, in August 2007, while trying to rehabilitate in Gainesville, Florida, he collapsed again. This time, it was a massive heart attack. His heart, the very organ that had dictated the foundational pulse of 20th century music, was giving out. He was hospitalized, surrounded by monitors and wires, a prisoner of a failing biological machine. The street fighter from Maxwell Street, the deputy sheriff of Los Lunas, the man who had fought Chess Records and Nike, was now facing the only adversary he could not outplay. As the year 2008 approached, Ellis McDaniel was brought back to his home in Archer, Florida, where his family gathered around the bedside of a dying king, preparing for the final, quiet transition of the man who had made the whole world loud. The transition to death for Ellis McDaniel was not a desperate struggle, but a profound reclamation of peace. Broken by a severe stroke and a heart attack, the 79-year-old pioneer returned to his home in Archer, Florida, surrounded not by the predatory executives who had picked his pockets, but by his bloodline. On June 2, 2008, as his breathing slowed, his family sang the gospel hymn, "Walk Around Heaven." The irony was staggering. The man who electrified the devil's music was being ushered out of the world on the very sacred melodies of his youth. Defying his failing neurology one last time, the unresponsive giant opened his eyes. He raised his heavy hand, gave a firm thumbs up, and smiled, "Wow, I'm going to heaven." It was an exclamation of absolute victory. He had survived Mississippi terror, Chicago streets, and corporate theft, leaving the world entirely on his own terms. His public farewell in Gainesville was a 4-hour eruption of rhythm. As his casket moved, the thousands in attendance could not maintain the silence. Spontaneously, the crowd locked into the ancient hambone clave, bump, ba bump, 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 chanting, "Hey Bo Diddley," to send the architect home on his own foundation. The hierarchy of attendees served as a final, glaring indictment of the industry. The corporate executives who had built mansions off his stolen publishing rights were entirely absent. Instead, rock royalty and disciples like Eric Burdon and Tom Petty arrived in force. Knowing their own careers rested squarely on his blueprint, the institutional music establishment spent his twilight years attempting to sanitize their exploitation by burying him under plastic trophies, including Hall of Fame inductions and a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award. Diddley accepted these with stoic grace, viewing them not as apologies, but as overdue receipts from an industry that had starved him of his mechanical royalties. Far more fitting was the honorary doctorate he received from the University of Florida and the renaming of a Gainesville Plaza to honor his relentless charity work for the homeless. He never forgot what Diddley squat meant, using his guitar to shield those discarded by the same society that had tried to discard him. Yet, the predatory nature of the American legal system does not respect the grave. Following his death, corporate vultures circled his estate, attempting to maintain a suffocating grip on his intellectual property. It was a harrowing echo of the past, a white legal entity attempting to control the generational wealth of a black creator. But this time, his family refused to surrender. They engaged in a grueling, decade-long legal war and, in 2019, achieved a definitive victory. They legally wrested total control of the estate away from the exploiters, finally breaking the generational curse. To evaluate Bo Diddley is to completely discard the sanitized nostalgia of early rock and roll. The truth is raw and undeniable. He was a survivor of economic and racial warfare who channeled his lifelong marginalization into a frequency the world could not ignore. He took the body-slapping rhythm of enslaved people, wired it into a rectangular block of wood, and forced a segregated nation to dance to the exact pulse of the people it had tried to destroy. Robbed of his millions, he refused to be robbed of his dignity. He elevated female musicians, mentored the next generation, and looked the gatekeepers in the eye to play his own name. Every time a distorted guitar chugs, and every time a stadium crowd claps their hands in unison, the ghost of Ellis McDaniel is in the room. They took his publishing rights. They took his television appearances. But they could never take the beat. As long as there is music, the originator lives.